Good morning and welcome to Better Waste Services episode 7. As always, I'm joined by Louise Lamborn. Good morning, Louise.
Good morning.
We're in this wonderful studio in the hipster capital of the world, Shoreditch. This is the second time in a row.
Is?
Yeah, definitely. Well, now I'm here.
Oh, yeah, true.
Yeah, so we've... this is the second time we've actually done this in the room together, so we promise not to rumble tummies or laugh at each other too much, don't we, Louise?
I know, but this is the problem. I'm nervous because last time it was all... There you go. It's already started.
We're off already. And I'm delighted to welcome to the studio today Mr. David Maidman of Canterbury Environment Company, otherwise known as Canenco. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Tim. Good morning, Louise.
So normally at this point in the proceedings, we ask our guests to just introduce themselves and tell us how they got here today. Not which train you came on, but your journey through life that led you to your esteemed position in the waste industry.
It's not very interesting, but I've been in the waste industry, over 20 years now, ended up here really by default. And that's a story probably in for a podcast all of its own.
One day someone will actually come in and say, I've always wanted to be in the waste industry, but without exception, every single person has said, I don't know how I ended up here. It was an accident.
Yeah, everyone's fallen into it.
I think that's a very, very common theme. I've said many times in introductory presentations, I certainly did not lay on my bed as a 17, 18-year-old teenager staring at a poster of Kate Bush thinking, gosh, I can't wait till I reach middle age and I can be collecting bins and working in the waste industry. That really wasn't what I aspired to. However, I did end up here. It's out of everything that I've done previously, it's the most satisfying industry. And I'm not just saying that. It is very, very rewarding with equal measure of frustration all the way through. But it gets into your blood, it gets under your skin, and there is something quite unique about it, which I've loved, and it's been good to me, shall I say.
So what was your first job in the industry?
So I joined a little fledgling company at the time called Verdant, and I joined as what they affectionately called me, a contract portfolio manager. So I had a number of contracts, and which I had sort of responsibility. So the business manager, the depot manager reported directly to me, and they were spread around the country. So we had everything from Anglesey down to Gosport to Uttlesford over in Essex. So I got to like the inside of my car quite a lot, and that was quite entertaining. And then Verdant then was sold then to Green Star, and then Green Star ultimately onto Biffa, and then I worked my way through various roles of contract portfolio manager, and then ultimately became a director of municipal services, and then left Biffa back in 2020, and did 12 months of consultancy. Tried to had a go at that. Did a bit of that on my own, which was a really enjoyable 12 months. Very, very different. And then in 2021 joined the Canterbury Environment Company as MD, which was a newly set up LATCO for Canterbury City Council. So since 2021, I've been in sunny Canterbury, which is immensely good fun. So that is my little journey.
So Verdant and Green Star, what sort of size of contracts were they? Were they comparable to Canterbury now?
There was a wide myriad of different services. I mean, at the time, Uttlesford was quite unique in the sense that it was like a managed service. So the authority, they provided the depots, they provided the trucks, and we provide a management team, supervisory team, and we pay the wages. And that's very, very simple. That's changed greatly up there. And in fact, the office we had wasn't in the depot. We had it was like a 15th, 16th century office in the middle of Dunmow High Street, which was quite hilarious because, so these huge, great 26-ton dust carts pulled up on the high street and the crews got out and ran in this office and we were sat there surrounded by oak beams, steeped in history.
Well, Uttlesford is very like that, yeah.
It was lovely. It was a great, and there's some fantastic guys up there. And sort of, probably going off at a tangent, one of the most sort of rewarding things probably of my 20-year journey is we had a driver there who had a lot of potential, a lot of opportunity, but didn't really know how to unlock it. when we were recruiting for a supervisor, we managed to persuade him to apply, and we made him a supervisor. And ultimately, he's worked his way through been employed within Biffa and Serco, and is now back working with myself down in Canterbury. I won't embarrass him and name him, but that's been one of the most pleasurable work experiences I've had of seeing someone being given that opportunity to develop and realise their potential. And that's what this industry can deliver, and I don't think we maximise enough of that, if I'm honest.
You've actually come to one of the things I was going to ask you later on, but we'll do it now, because I see quite a parallel with, if you look at the police service or the armed forces or any of those uniform things, there's people who join on a fast track, they do their degree or whatever, and they come in at management level, and that's one set of strengths. And then there's the people who sort of start at the sharp end, and I think, and then make it through to the management roles. And I think actually the waste industry is pretty good at letting people do that in a way that a lot of industries are not. I see a lot of people in senior positions who know how it works because they've done it. They've been out on the bins. That's where they started. In fact,
they seem to work in lots of different departments. All my contacts then move on to somewhere else and then get involved in a project there and then move on. It is quite nice because then you get all the experience of all the different parts of the.
Yeah, it's very true, and I think that's been one of the strengths of the industry. I think looking forward, and one of the challenges going forward is, can we continue with that? Does that actually work? Because that development of people is really, really critical. So are those base level skills there with in the lower ranks, for one better description, that allows that sort of development? I think the army, the military tend to work on a very, very good sort of principle is, if you're the custodian of something, you always hand it over in a better condition than it was previously. I think that's really a really good lesson. The whole development of people is something that the industry really does need to sort of focus and maximise on. And I think within bigger organisations or more corporates, that tends to be easier. I think if you're in a local authority trading company or a LATCO, TECO company or a DSO, that sometimes can be a little bit harder, and guys can feel a bit isolated, and therefore the career opportunities are somewhat less, or could be interpreted as less. So it's how do you maximise those, I think, is really the key. And ironically, it was a subject of conversation I actually had with a number of other people in the industry this week about supervisor development. But
I think through the pandemic, we saw a lot of supervisors sort of stepping back to being drivers because there was nobody to drive. So we had this. I certainly witnessed this sort of chasm of, for want of a better phrase, middle management, because anybody who could drive was driving. So there was no supervision going on. The managers were actually being supervised. The supervisors were driving, and I think that was difficult, but it was perhaps a little bit refreshing for the managers to actually step down and actually do some supervising, and for the supervisors to get back out on the truck. And the other point I was going to make was that you sent me an ancient BBC newsreel from, I don't know when it was, the 1970s or something.
Gosh.
This was a few weeks ago. You sent me this, and it was newsreel of guys, in the olden days, literally with dust in tipping it into the back of the wagon, and they were actually taking the scrap and selling it as part of their round. It's a completely different way of working. Those guys were working completely manually, no reporting structures, certainly no IT. I think the modern bin man, we don't call them bin men anymore, but the modern bin man is actually a computer operator. They are following a navigation system. They are filling in reports, and so actually, do you think they're in a better position now to step up into a management role because they're getting that IT exposure than they would have done hitherto?
I think, in theory, you would say yes. I'm trying desperately not to sound old. And look back through rose-tinted glasses, but there seems to be a different culturally. There's a different attitude in the workforce than there was 20, 30 years ago. You don't seem to have the lifers when Battlesford is a classic example. But any one of those contracts at the time, 95% of that workforce were guys who had been there 15, 18, 20 years. They came into it, and that was good, and they had that consistency. But not only were they consistent, I think you've got to overlay that with society hadn't moved on socially and culturally. everything was quite static. The service, when they joined at, 17, 18, they were probably picking up sacks and putting it into the back of an open back dust cart with no lifters, no wheel bins. 25 years later, they were picking up sacks and putting it into the back of an open back dust cart. I think
that's common in a lot of industries, isn't it? I mean, you left school, you either did the job your dad did, or you did something weird and went and did something else. But you kind of stuck with that for your life. You made that decision at the age of 18 or whatever, and that was the job you did until you retired.
The lifers.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody does that in any industry anymore, or certainly not to that extent. So, yeah, those transferable skills is common now.
It's certainly less common. Less common. So I think in answer to your question, in yes, they are better placed. They should be better placed. But organisations need to maximise. How do you maximise that opportunity? How do you maximise this technologically advanced generation that certainly we weren't at that particular time?
Yeah. So, it comes back to something that Ben at Harrow, Head of Digital, was saying. In his team, he has people who know nothing about IT, and it's a really good way of bringing people into IT, but also getting that perspective of people who actually they're not steeped in all the terminology, they're not steeped in all the IT nonsense, as I'm sure he wouldn't describe it. But it's good to have that constant flow of people. So I think there's a benefit to the lifers, and then there's a benefit to actually having the new blood coming in, particularly new blood that doesn't know what it's doing and is eager to pick up new skills and bring a new perspective.
I would agree with that. I totally agree with that. And by bringing that new blood in, from different experiences, different walks of life, it can only be good. Generally, I've always found is that people moving into that sort of first steps of management, supervision, whatever you want to call it, is the industry knowledge is probably secondary to their attitude and approach, or what I would call is what's in there. You can teach somebody the different sizes of wheel bins and the difference between a curbside collection and all the other sort of jargon and bits and pieces that we have, how they communicate with people, how they're that sort of general management. And that soft skills, I think, is becoming more and more important. Again, probably one of the big differences of a number of years when it was, very much, people were spoken to, rightly or wrongly, and you can debate that one. But, generally people were spoken to. Whereas now it's very much, an explanation, and it's those whole softer communication skills. And I think the other reason that's required is, when you ask somebody to do something 20 years ago, they generally went off and did it. Now you're having to explain a lot more to people, what's their motivation? Why am I here?
Yeah.
So can you explain to me and anyone else who maybe doesn't have a good understanding of it, what a LATCO actually is?
I'll endeavour.
Thank you.
LATCO is again one of the lovely acronyms that we all use. So it stands for Local Authority Trading Company. It was put in to give local authorities greater commercial flexibility. So there is a percentage value of a contract value that you can undertake commercial work, which is giving the authority more flexibility to generate revenue, which a direct services organisation works under a different set of rules. There's a few other technicalities. So they operate as an independent company, so you're not actually part of the council. In the same way that a direct services organisation is. So our employees are employed by the Canterbury Environment Company, not by the local authority. But we have to comply and abide with certain rules and regulations as a council-owned company.
Can you work for other councils?
Yes, we could. And many do. We currently do not do any sort of additional commercial work. We certainly don't operate commercial waste services collection or anything like that. We do a small amount of events, but that's sort of off the back of normal events that would appear under the contract anyway. Some of those the council do not support, so we do directly, but it's very, very small, very minimal amount for us. Other authorities do, and that can be anything from commercial work. One of our neighbours just up the road, they do quite a lot of commercial work through their workshop, so they will support a local waste company or taxis, and they do all the taxi servicing and MOTs and the checks, and other works through that. So that is seen as a revenue stream, and that's quite important for some authorities because of the pressures on funding. That's really a big pressure at the moment, and the pressure that everybody is on in terms of budgets and saving, and that opportunity to deliver commercial services is a challenge for local authorities.
Do you think this is the way that more councils will move forward then in order to get that funding?
There's been a general trend towards LATCOs. I mean, we deal with a lot more LATCOs than we ever used to, and places where services are coming in-house from a BIF of Veolia, Suez sort of contractor arrangement. A lot of those are coming into a newly formed LATCO, which I think was the situation you had in Canterbury.
And I think one of the drivers, rather than sort of the technicality of what is a LATCO, I think one of the drivers for Canterbury was that flexibility within the contract. So a traditional contract sometimes is not adversarial, but if you're asked to do something different, the contractor naturally will price that in the same way that if you have a decorator around and you ask him to paint 3 bedrooms, and then the price he's given you at halfway through the job turn around and say, "Excuse me, could you paint a 4th bedroom?" The expectation that he's going to do that for the price of painting 3 would be relatively unrealistic. So when a contractor sort of says, "Yeah, but you're asking me now to do something different, I would like to price for that," the authorities sometimes historically have got into a bit of a mix with that, and doesn't sit comfortably in the contract. So one of the drivers for Canterbury was to offer that greater flexibility. And I think the trend, and as Tim has said, the increase of that was also not knowing what the definitive sort of UK waste policy strategy was going to be. So authorities didn't want to be sort of not strangled, but sort of restricted by a contract in that way, and a LATCO would give them greater flexibility. And we certainly have we've certainly delivered greater flexibility through the contracts since 2021 than I've seen probably in comparison to working with local authorities through a pure contractual relationship.
Does it give you a challenge in that, if you've got a pure relationship with a contractor who is there to make a profit, because that's what they do, now you are, although you're a separate company, you are owned by the council. So are you more at the political whim of people who suddenly want to change things because you can't as easily just say, "We're not doing that, it's not in the contract"?
Probably, ironically, no, but there is a political impact. I think we're, as a LATCO, you are closer to the political machine than you would be as a contractor. Political with a small p, I should say. Yeah. You definitely are. We are closer to those relationships. We've seen a change of administration, and so we're seeing quite in quite a short space of time, quite a different approach to ourselves on that. But the influence is not. It's not as direct as you would think. Councillors by default, I think they, and this is the first thing everybody says is, "Oh yeah, but they'll get you running around because they now want this done and they want that done." They've probably always done that. I don't think that's a LATCOism. I think that probably exists within a direct services organisation,
and that is their job, isn't it?
And
that's the nature
arguably,
of the beast.
Yeah, and that's they're interested in their constituents, and they're there to deliver, a value service and a high level of service. Get all of that as in exactly the same as we are. I think as a pure contractor or sort of a Veolia or Suez, as I've said before, I think you're slightly more distant from that because you will have the authority's sort of contractual team and organisation that sits, and they sit between you. So they act as more of a buffer and a filter. So you don't have the direct political contact. What you'd have had is the requests or those questions or instructions would have been coming through from the contract team.
Right. Does the LATCO, because you are owned by the council, does that make it easier or cheaper to do things like raise finance and buy vehicles and that sort of stuff because it's effectively government debt rather than commercial debt?
God, I'd rather not say.
Then don't.
I won't. Definitely don't.
I've heard it said to me.
I'm not sure how others structure, but the council they fund everything for us.
Right, so that probably answers the question that the council are actually providing the capital.
Yeah, so they're
providing the capital equipment.
Okay, so in answer to your question, how it works for ourselves is the council have funded all the capital, and that was a trend, I think, even within contracting through what was termed, I don't know if it still is, but it was termed as prudential funding and things like that, because the authorities were relatively capital rich and didn't want the operating costs through the contract, so they would fund fleets and et cetera, and that had been going on for a good 5-7 years prior to my leaving, BIFA. But so that helps. That certainly helps. When we started, of course, there was one of the challenges for the LATCO is when you went to certain suppliers, even not even talking about capital funding, but even setting up that supply chain, was the technicality of you don't have a trading history.
Yes.
So whilst you're underwritten, as a local authority trading company, you are underwritten almost by the council. That gives most suppliers a lot of comfort. But depending on their own processes and approach, if they want to take, I think, a very pragmatic line is, you don't have a trading history. So, payment terms and invoicing terms was always quite an interesting conversation.
So when we started our relationship as a business with Canterbury, just at the point where they were about to start the LATCO process, we obviously sold to the council because the LATCO didn't exist at that point. It struck me that you've got a lot of people there who've maybe had 10, 15, 20 years of having this service outsourced. There's no experience base in the council to do this stuff, and suddenly they're saying, we're going to run a waste service. How do you go about that? And I've seen that done. I've seen that repeated in lots of places where optimism of, yes, we're going to do this, it's going to be great, then gradually gets hit by the steam train of reality. If they just don't know how, they don't even know what the questions are, let alone the answers.
Yeah, I think if I had an answer to that, I'd probably be quite a rich person. I think
it's a hell of a leap, though, isn't it, from having not run a service and had it completely outsourced to it's almost like saying, every year, to use your example, every year I get my house painted, and I've decided that from now on I'm going to do it myself.
So it's the same people. So
there are no people, are they? Because the contractor have taken all their staff and it's all gone away.
The contract, the skill set that sits within a local authority, and I think is a relatively common experience. So this is not necessarily relative to. This is not necessarily relevant to Canterbury alone in any way, shape, or form. But the skill set of running a contractor is very different to running an operation, which in essence is what you're saying. So the setup, you've got to have both sets of skills when you're doing that mobilization. And I think it comes around to the whole sort of classic project management. You've got to have people from all facets of that service. And I think where sometimes, in effect, authorities may struggle or have not made that realization is if you don't have the operational input, you don't get the benefit. You then in danger of having legacy issues, which then get built in by people, as you say, who don't have that knowledge and understanding. And that's one of the challenges. We certainly have had that challenge in certain areas. It's not unsurmountable, but it adds to the level of inefficiency.
Yeah, and it's very difficult you can't gradually migrate a service from one to the other. I mean, we've just done the contract in Portsmouth where BIFA exit, Portsmouth suddenly start running the service, and that on Friday it's BIFA, on Monday it's Portsmouth City Council.
Yes.
And so that would be a LATCO?
Yeah, whatever it is.
Whatever it is it
Friday,
brought in-house?
Yeah, on Friday all the bins have been emptied by BIFA. On Monday, you've got to do them. And you can't phase that in over a 3-month period.
Yeah, that has to be a date, doesn't there, when it comes into effect?
It is, as we've said, it's big bang by default because it's not like a retail business. You can walk down a high street and on Wednesday morning it will say, we'll open late for staff training. Really? Okay. Well, how lovely. Yeah. We can't put something out. The authority can't put something out. The contractor can't put something out and says, well, we're taking over. We'll start collecting the bins on Wednesday, or we'll be a couple of hours late for the first week because we're training and we're doing all of this. You have to hit the ground running. And then, so that's that is and anyone who's been through contract takeover and mobilisation hopefully is watching this and nodding their heads and agreeing. But it is a phenomenal challenge. So there's a huge amount of work that you have to do prior to that to hit the ground running. Also on the backdrop is you've then got elements of legalese and legality issues going on behind the scenes. Is from that time you take over your responsibility for their health and safety and so training, sharing risk assessments, assessing all of that stuff, doing all of that is a phenomenal challenge. Now, helps that you can lift and shift certain stuff and you can take a generic approach on certain elements, but you still then have to review that pretty quickly to say, right, okay, well, is that really that relevant, rather than just take a generic waste collection assessment, because all services are slightly different. So yes, it's an interesting challenge, and mobilisation itself is incredibly good fun.
Would everyone call it that?
Everybody would call it incredibly good fun.
Yes.
The amount of hours and weekends lost. And I think the big thing that everybody tends to lose on a contract mobilisation is you've got the outgoing contractor is also having to do whatever they need to do. So there is a massive pressure point on those supervisors and the people that are transferring over, who are trying to satisfy the needs of the outgoing contractor, and they're trying to be all things to the incoming contractor as well. So
and still picking up the bins,
and as well as still.
I was going to say, where does this fall down then? Where does this fall down in that first? Everywhere. In that first, I'm thinking that first 6 months surely must be the critical of that changeover. Where's it most likely to fall down?
Good question. Service delivery.
So the resident side.
Yeah.
Well, you've got to bring a lot of data, haven't you? So on the Monday when you've got this brand new service, you're presumably doing the routes that the contractor gave you when they walked out the door on Friday afternoon and said, "There you go, that's what we do."
In theory, yes. Let's come back to that point. But so if you have a typical, let's refer to it as lift and shift. So as you say, you're doing exactly the same on Monday morning than you were doing on Friday night. Generally, the industry doesn't work well with change. So you've got the same guys doing what they did on this Monday that they did last Monday. What you've given them is a different vehicle, potentially. Probably historic. Quite often it's the same vehicle, just has a different registration, and you've given them a slightly different uniform. Yeah. From an outsider looking in, you would think that's not a great deal of change. It is for the guys involved, because they do not do. When I say they do not, it's a massive generalization. I do agree, but they generally don't change. They don't do particularly well.
A lot of people are in this industry doing this job because they don't like to change and they don't like to work in a dynamic way. They don't want to be answerable and micromanage minute by minute. And of course, one thing that you're definitely doing on day one is you're micromanaging because you want to know that it's all going well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it is a big change.
It is phenomenal, and it comes back to that sort of what we were talking earlier in terms of the sort of the supervisory softer skills, because that's when they really come. They really come out to the full, and it's the age-old adage, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Good old granny.
But there's also a backdrop that even if you say, well, we've just changed the logo on the fleece and we've put a different wrap on the truck, it's the same job. Over that weekend, the local press have been trumpeting about how this service is changing.
Yes.
The public is looking because they've been promised that, well, the council spent X million bringing this contract in-house, it's all going to be wonderful. So by Monday lunchtime, it better be bloody wonderful, or you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, I often think that the media doesn't really help a lot of these changes because it makes everyone so vigilant on what could possibly go wrong. And although it may have happened before, they now notice it. Yeah,
and politicians are not great at managing expectations, are they?
And it is exactly all about that of managing expectations. I mean, my personal ideal scenario would be lift and shift to start with. As an operator, you then get under the skin of the depot, you get under the skin of the workforce, you get under the skin of the authority as well. So you understand what works, what doesn't work. And then you look to make those changes and that evolution. Because sometimes what works in theory and what may work on paper, you go in and try and do that from day one, bang it. Yeah, that's often, I think, the greater risk of failure. because you're just minimizing those bits that you can change. Change the rounds, reorganize it when everyone's used to wearing pink rather than blue and has got, XY vehicle versus ABC vehicle. So you've already gone through that familiarity and people have got used to the new regime, and now you're making a level of change.
How long did it take for everyone to kind of get used to it and everyone on board with the change? So both staff and I guess residents with that.
I tend to work on everything that we do. I tend to work on the rule of thirds. So whatever change you make, you get a third will take to it like a duck to water, and they'll get it. You'll get the other third right at the other end of the scale. You've got to go through it a lot of times, and you've got to do a lot of convincing, and you've got a lot of communication. And then you've got your middle third that after a couple of times, and they'll see it, they'll maybe resist initially. Not resist, but they won't necessarily get it. Is that their fault, or is that just how it's been put across? But they will get it eventually. So whatever you're doing you can work in those thirds, whether it was the adoption of tablets when we adopted tablets historically, whether you've done change where you've done round changes, just that rule of three tends to work.
So for the guys who are in the service and they're just two-bit across or whatever they've done, it's a different shirt and different logo and all the rest of it. But for you never worked for you personally, you never worked for the old contractor.
Yep.
Presumably you didn't walk in fresh-faced on the Monday morning and go, I am here, how's it all going? I mean, there was a bit of a lead-in, but I would imagine you were fairly dependent on the data that you had, and we all know that the data that you have is not what the crews are actually doing. And in an outgoing contractor who's probably not got any great investment in maintaining that data, did what you actually have on the paper and the reports and the plans bear any relation to what was going on?
No, yes, no, yes, no. There were some challenges around the data, and there was some different sort of data sets. But you're right, we didn't. Looking back, and I think probably the authority would agree, the mobilization could be longer. Yes, you could always turn around and say you never have long enough. But we took over the service on February the 1st, and I joined on January the 6th. Now, I was involved prior remotely and whatever, but actually on site. We had some added complications because this was all during COVID, and so it's not comparable to a sort of a non-COVID event, if there's such a thing.
Yeah. But 3 weeks isn't very long to.
But a month is not particularly long, and I think it comes back. Our experience, the Canterbury experience, there wasn't if you take the iceberg, 80% of the project was actually the day-to-day stuff and what the authority knew above, rather than the operational side. So there was a classic sort of Pareto's law coming into play. The existing crews had been used to using a level of technology because it was an in-house system, and in terms of and then we adopted the proprietary system. But you're right in terms of the data, and I think being fair at the time, certain assumptions had to be made for exactly the reasons that you've just said. Maintaining data and all of those things, and that legacy that's what's transpired through. So you've ended up with a simple situation where every low-level property has been defaulted to a set of bins. Now, not every one of those properties has those bins. Either they don't exist, or they just didn't want to use the recycling service, or possibly they were accessing a communal container or a SAC part of the service. So relying on that data for counts and crew information has been quite problematic initially, and it just elongates the process. But I don't think anyone would ever say there is a perfect clean set of data that is there at a contract mobilization, and even 3 years into it. I mean, then we know there are some errors in our data. Put a hand up to that. There's no point saying otherwise. And I think everybody else would say exactly the same.
Everyone is on a spectrum of data quality.
Yeah.
At different points. If you waited for perfect data, you'd never start anything.
No. And I'm not an LLPG, local land property gazetteer.
Thank you.
I'm not an LLPG expert, but one of the things when we got involved with technology in terms of waste management systems, one of the things that everybody always said is, oh, well, the LLPG is master and all authorities are running an LLPG database. Great. But there seems to be different ways of managing a consistent LLPG database.
Yeah, it's fairly consistent, but
it's consistent, but there are idiosyncrasies.
And Canterbury has a pretty transient population, and you've got universities and a lot of student and holiday type stuff. So it's not a stable population in terms of the people that are in and out.
And the student challenge, and anyone who's operating a contract in a university area, it's a phenomenal challenge. In Canterbury, we have, I think it's 4 universities.
Right.
So that is this huge influx of students. We've also seen in the last few years quite a shift of student accommodation. So historically, students came in and they went into there were student rental areas, street after street, certain blocks, certain areas were always demographically known as sort of student areas. The universities have now started building, or have been building, purpose-built student accommodation. Not really sure the drivers for it. Probably revenue, probably income. It's a way of containing people, but actually it's delivering, I think, a better service to the student, better learning environment, probably better IT, broadband, and all of those other things that go along with it. They can deliver, I think, a far better offering. But the reality is, what that's meant is those traditional areas are now becoming a little bit fragmented, and that's presenting certain operational challenges. The student accommodation itself then has a lot of operational challenges itself, in the sense that, do people engage with the recycling service?
I was going to say, is this because of buy-in? Like resident buy-in of the service, like doing recycling, doing food waste, doing
absolutely, and it's it's the student buy-in, it's a landlord buy-in, and as you've alluded to earlier, it's a transient population. I mean, it's not even 12 months. People arrive in September, and most of them have gone by the end of May. So you've got quite a whole time, and then you've got another set that comes in September. So you're permanently You've got to keep reinvesting in that communication, piece.
I often do wonder about that, on how people are going to do that around the food waste, and that communication, if it's constantly changing, and also different languages, different areas have different demographics that are required, and that constant need to communicate and get people's buy-in on it. I don't know how to even begin to look at that for any council.
I think, and hope most would agree, there is no silver bullet. So you have to do lots of things, and I think it's a sort of a relatively typical marketing scenario. You do a number of these things, but you're not actually sure which one is generating the result. It's trying to get the buy-in. But if I look back to my student experience, I don't think at the time I was probably that concerned around environmental impact and recycling X bit of cardboard. It was more about having a fantastic time and enjoying the whole student experience. So you've got to balance that as well, because that's never going to go away.
As an industry, I think we've spent the last decade, 2 decades, whatever, trying to get recycling rates up, and naturally the low-hanging fruit was the curbside, stable, residential, affluent areas that you could educate once. They're not going anywhere. So once you've got them a recycling bin and they start to use it, they'll keep using it. With the simpler recycling regs as they are, and plateauing of recycling rates, the industry as a whole and councils as a whole have got to go to communals. They've got to go to the what we've always called hard to reach.
Yep.
And it's like, as you say, marketing terms, you market to the people who really want your product to start with. But if you want to keep growing, then you've got to go and persuade the people who really don't want your product, and try and persuade them. And that's a very difficult challenge, particularly if they're only here for 9 months and then they're off again.
It is a challenge.
It's what's in it for them. And it's even less for someone who's only going to be there for a year. And always changing as well. So I'm really hoping that simpler recycling does have an element of keeping it the same for a length of time, because even our one, we keep getting constant changes. But you could put caps on milk cartons, and now you can't.
How do you communicate? Because you've got a food waste service.
Mm-hmm.
How well used is it?
Being honest, we don't really know. From participation that we've looked at, we think it's around about 40%. As an accurate participation number, we couldn't put an accurate figure on it. I think the communication of it, I think, is always it's one of those things that when you talk in isolation, everybody agrees. And everyone says, you've got to do all of these things. The challenge then comes within the pressures of budgetary and spend to turn around and say, why am I going to spend all this money year on year on year on year? And you have to continually change the message, because what you told people last year, if that hasn't delivered X, you then change the following year. So you have the whole sort of that bit of a plan where it's informative, it's, and you're trying to get people's buy-in, and then the following year it may be a bit more aggressive or a bit more directional. But you have to keep changing the message, because certain things works for certain people. And I think one of the things that people often miss with a weekly food waste, and we sometimes see this when you're following the crews and you are going out, is that people participate on, although it's a weekly food waste service, there is a percentage, and it is small, but there is a percentage that put their food caddy out on recycling week because they see it as a recycling service, but they don't put their caddy out on a refuse week.
So they just don't know it's weekly,
because they either don't realise it's weekly, or the temptation is. Now there may be lots of reasons for that. Volume may be one, but we know that does go on. It's relatively probably a small percentage. But coming back to that challenge of students and flatted or communals, it is a huge challenge. The food trials that we've done have worked. We've tried a number in different sort of types of different scenarios. The one, regardless of the little bit of the scheme difference, where they've been more successful is where there's been a champion at that location.
Right, okay.
Champion, we say we could open brackets, insert busybody, close brackets, but there is somebody there that knows what's going on. They know what day of the week it is. They might see the crews. They'll talk to people on the stairway. They'll talk to people in the car park. But so that's great. So there is somebody sort of, that lead, just that bit of focal point. That's what really seems to be the difference between success and not.
How do you connect with those people then? I mean, around where I live, we have what we call the Poggy Pickers, because I live in Pogmore, or near Pogmore, and they all get these purple sacks issued by the council, and they go around litter picking, and they dump the sack on the corner of the street, and then the council can pick them up. So the council are getting free litter picking, which is great, but also people in the community are out visibly litter picking, which definitely acts as a deterrent to people who live next door to somebody who's litter picking to drop their crisp packet on the floor. So I can see that working very well for food waste, but how do you incentivize those busybodies to actually,
I think it's a bit of a silver bullet question. I don't really, how do you? I think there's a slight difference of a sort of a collection or service champion at a location like that than a group that go out and community litter pick.
Yeah, because that's a social activity in itself.
Correct.
So
That's the authority is pretty good at communicating that, and I think the majority of authorities would be. And there is a lot of contact with various volunteer groups, community groups, and the authority, and to a degree contractors as well. It's phenomenal impact by those volunteer groups. As a contractor, we would look at it and you go, wow, you've got the general public walking up and down high-speed roads, but as a member of the public, they can do that.
Yes, they're allowed to.
They're not quite governed. The authority will have approvals, and they will have to, certain groups will have to submit certain risk assessments.
I was going to say, we had to do risk assessments. We did a litter pick in Dartford, and we had loads of forms to fill in before we did it.
But you, where I am locally, you will see these guys walking, along a main road, which you would not see a main contractor undertaking in that way. But the challenge also is a little bit around, root cause. So how is the litter getting there in the first place? Actually tackle the root cause rather than trying to have a pop at either the community group or the contractor who's trying to do something. But people people are less and less inclined, want the disruption of traffic management, because if you're going to do certain things, you have to have traffic management in place, as everybody will know. And that becomes quite intrusive and quite delaying, albeit I think people would be deliriously happy to see traffic management in place if potholes were mended, but let's steer away from that rich and that could be a podcast in its own right.
Oh goodness,
Yes,
that would be a rant podcast, wouldn't it? And then there'll be all kinds of what do you call them? Comments underneath.
But our volunteer groups are superb, but they're sort of managed, well, sort of. They are managed and controlled through the authority. So they register, so there is some control of knowing where they are. We have separate colour bags, as many do, so people, when they see the bags out on the street, it's not a fly tip. They can see that it's a community litter pick. That works. That also works quite well. And then there's just a communication relationship with us, so we know where they are and we pick them up either the same day or the following day as early as possible. Yeah. And that works.
One of the challenges we have as an organisation is that we're always trying to find social value, because in our tenders now we have to identify and provide social value as part of the contract. And actually assisting, empowering, developing food waste champions sounds like something that might have a social value aspect. If I could only bring to mind what it is, but there may be something there. So I'd be interested in getting a bit more info at some point about how you identify and empower those people, and make sure that they're given the right message, because you can send out somebody with empower them as a food waste champion, but if they're telling people the wrong thing, then it's counterproductive. So they can't be complete loose cannons, can they? No,
they can't. And again, there you have this sort of contradiction, because the power of those people is immense. Mm-hmm. But everybody becomes a little bit risk adverse of saying, well, we resist engaging because in case they say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And I think, sometimes is it better just to empower people and let them do something in the right way rather than sort of saying, not allowing anything. So, again, how does that all work?
I think this is going to be an issue for councils over the next few years. You've already got your food waste service. But the majority of councils don't have a food waste service. They're going to have to create a food waste service. Yeah. There's going to be changes for DRS if that eventually comes in. I think 2027 now.
Yeah. I was going to say that, and it came out the other day, didn't it? 27 now.
So what we know is that over the next 3 to 5 years, there's going to be probably an unprecedented amount of change in a large swathe of the population, and councils are going to have to communicate that to their residents.
Yes.
And I don't know that they've got particularly good channels of doing that, other than the traditional stuff of putting an ad in the paper, sending out a leaflet, putting a sticker on the bin, which all feels very one-dimensional and very broadcast rather than conversational. And I don't know how council are going to respond to that challenge.
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently, because our council is doing the pilot scheme of food waste, and it's not been very well received. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of buy-in straight away, because everyone's finding it too complicated. It hasn't been communicated particularly well. And I don't even know anything about it. And I'm actively looking, and I don't know anything about it. And it's a minefield. I've been trying to think of ways that PermaServe what we can do in order to help that, and think of ideas to get participation and buy-in, which normally is what do they get out of it? What's in it for them? Yeah, and I've been trying to think of ways of doing that.
And the government have just slammed the door on the stick approach of reducing the residual capacity, because it's still going to have to be fortnightly. Mm-hmm. So the ultimate power of your residual capacity is reducing, so you're going to have to start moving your food waste into the food waste caddy. That's gone. So what incentive is there to keep your caddy in your kitchen and do all that extra stuff when you can just keep piling it in the grey bin?
And it's a big challenge. It is a big challenge.
I mean, practically, I can't see a way that you can actually enforce food waste as a contaminant in the grey bin, so we're not going to pick up your grey bin because it's got food in it. That doesn't seem like something that could be done at scale.
I don't. I think the practicality of that is challenging. It is challenging enough with contamination and recycling generally, because your scheme or an authority, depending on its disposal arrangements, won't collect a material that has clearly got a recycling label on it, which in essence is part of the whole ethos of the simpler recycling.
Yeah.
I think the simpler recycling overall, I think will deliver, and the principles of it, I think, is good, because it's been too long where there's been a lot of lack of clarity in terms of for authorities of what they're doing. So I think at least it now gives some structure. I think everyone is slightly nervous if they're not doing it in terms of the capital requirements and how, the affordability of that. And that is the challenge with any trial scheme. So whether someone's trialing stuff at the moment, slightly cynical that very few trials, I think, ever cease. They just continue and become the norm. There's enough experience in the majority of change that needs to occur is experience within the UK. Well, there's experience within contractors, there's experience within local authorities. So really, do you need to undertake a trial? It seems to be an expensive, costly process where loads and loads of people are already doing it. So you know what works and you know what people don't know what doesn't work. Interestingly, we were having a conversation only yesterday and some feedback on this film collection, which is the pilot on the whole plastic film collection. So that is another sort of, if you like, dare I say, can of worms in itself. So for as you say, for us, we're already doing a food waste collection for low level properties. To make that leap within the next couple of years to be now collecting plastic film, depending on what the disposal arrangements will be, because we're not in control of that as a collection authority. That's down to the disposal authority. But the principles of the trial, you could see, there's some good stuff that's being done there. You could see the practicality of that. But for areas that are not, or residents that are not participating in a food waste collection, as you say, the period of change in the next couple of years to be going, right, you're going to introduce this food waste collection weekly service. Oh, and by the way, 12, 18 months later, I now want you to put out a bag. We're going to send you a separate bag where you put all your plastic film in. You can imagine people turning around and just going, wow, this is just overly complex. And I think, the whole concept of trying to make things as simplistic as at a base level, curbside recycling operated both systems, both schemes, and I know there's pros and cons of both. If recycling is all based around the success of participation, getting residents engaged, why would you not have a commingled service?
Yeah, well, that's
because it's the most simplistic thing to communicate. It's the most simplistic thing for people to understand. And yet we have curbside sort, and curbside sort works and delivers in lots of established systems, and I've operated both. But I think from a resident perspective, and then now you're seeing a level of change, albeit, okay, food waste won't interact. But if you're now introducing plastic film, and inevitably there will be something else. So simpler recycling in 2032 will be a plastic coat hanger scheme or something else that will come along.
Well, we're already running small scale schemes that are popping up in there. There's Podback doing the coffee pods.
Yeah, I was going to say I've seen that recently.
There's battery recycling schemes. Yep. There's textile recycling. Those things often go together.
Yes,
we've got small appliances as well. You can leave out.
Yeah, we've broken bulky waste up into bulky pops, asbestos, scrap. So there's potentially 4 or 5 different streams of bulky waste. So we are making it more and more granular, more complicated. I've just come back from America, and their approach is pilot all in one bin, and we'll spend an absolute fortune on sortation. Because then we'll just say to the public, put it in there.
Which is better or more cost effective for the council?
If you say which is better, you will just get a myriad of response and a reaction to the podcast.
But it's similar cost.
I think part of the challenge is that people look at it. You can look at it in silo. So people, because the collection authority may not be the disposal authority. The disposal authority won't want the additional cost of having to sort. The collection authority don't want the additional cost of collection, and sometimes the two are not necessarily always hand in glove. There's got to be there is always a balance, and there will be a solution. Let alone you've got different lengths of periods of contract that expire. MRF technology, materials recycling facility.
I'm getting a very good education today of all my acronyms, aren't I? I haven't written any of them down.
But MRF technology is it's not cheap.
No.
It's phenomenally sophisticated, and it's not something that you reinvest in or throw away every sort of 3, 4, 5 years. So you're investing in a scheme that then and technology that's going to do stuff. So you've got to have a level of that inbuilt flexibility, and something that's upgradable. The same with a service. So it just I don't know. Perhaps the logic for me seems to be collect it more together and use the technology of being able to sort it. I think food obviously is a different challenge. Gardening is a different challenge for different reasons. But it's going to be the next few years. I think going back to Tim's sort of original point, really, of saying the amount of change that local authorities are going to have to address. And the challenge that comes with that, both in terms of resourcing, budgets and everything else, let alone the change to the resident. So how does that, in them, as you say, impact on communication? Budgets, again, you've got to have the budget to communicate effectively. And any communication now, a number of years ago, was you sent people a leaflet, you dropped something onto the bin. Now you have it's a huge machine, and I think some have gone the other way of using sort of digital communication too much, and coming away from sort of printed material. Where I think actually the better solution is probably a balance of the both, because I'm interested in a lot of things, but I do not follow my utility company on Facebook. I don't follow the county council for roads on Facebook. I don't think I'm particularly alone. So,
no, but likewise, I don't read leaflets.
I started
there we go. Case in point.
To see what comes through my door. But there's definitely a lot more marketing coming through the door again.
Yeah.
It went dead, and now I'm starting to see lots more coming through.
If you put a leaflet through my letterbox, I won't read it.
I think a lot of people would be exactly the same.
I can't remember what it was. Somebody said they did it's a conversation a few weeks ago. They'd done a leaflet drop, and it was quite sort of soul destroying for them, because what they could immediately see was it was all in the paper recycling in their MRF. So they did the leaflet drop, and then it's all our leaflets.
It's a percentage game.
Circular economy right there. Some people will read that, some people won't. I think this single approach to anything does not work.
It's as simpler recycling defined. One size doesn't fit all.
No.
That is such a powerful message when it comes to communication and marketing.
So, based on your experience of having sort of jumped into a LATCO with a month's notice, what advice, or give us 3 sort of hot tips for someone who's about to create a LATCO?
Gosh,
and you're not allowed to say don't, and don't.
Planning and preparation, and how first, certainly not in any real order, is have very much a clear strategy in terms of what is the LATCO there to achieve, and what change, and all of those. What is it there to deliver, and measure that going forward. And thirdly, is to consider the people who are running that, because it is because there are challenges with just lift and shifting under 2P of the existing people, because you're just transferring in the same attitude, the same challenges. That might sound a little bit harsh, because that's what 2P is there for, but they're probably the 3 key things I would say.
Thank you.
Why would a council start looking at this, going to LATCO? What point would that journey start? Like, when would what question would have been raised to the decision makers in order to get to the point of going, right, let's start a LATCO?
I think each council will probably vary, but I think probably the precursor to that will be around affordability. So it may be affordability under an existing contract. If it isn't affordability, it's probably being driven by flexibility. So the existing contract may be deemed as unflexible.
I suppose there's a natural point when that contract is 2 years from ending, and there's then a question about, are we extending, are we retendering?
Yes.
So that's a natural point to do, isn't it?
And a lot of contracts have been there's a number of contracts that have been extended. And you've also seen within a procurement process, if you've been in a contract for 7 odd years or 9 years, quite often the old contract is sort of dragged out of a folder somewhere, dusted down, revamped. Is it actually, is it really fit for purpose? Is it, there are elements within that. And also then it's the whole data availability of tendering accurately on it.
So having sat on both sides of the contractor and LATCO fence, which is best?
Fantastic question.
Is it one you want to answer?
I'm probably going to stay on the fence.
I would expect nothing else.
And I think it rather depends. It all depends, right? It all depends on where the authority is at and what model suits. Why buy a Ford versus a BMW? It's what suits, what's relevant, and above all, what is affordable. So there are pros and cons of both, and I don't think there is a right or a wrong answer. It will work. I think everything in life tends to be cyclical. So whereas we went through the whole cycle of best value contracts and all of that, and then into LATCO, everything will run, and everything could come going back around the other side of the circle again.
So having built up a set of sort of core competencies in Canenco, emptying bins being obviously the main one, but you must have built up good processes for health and safety, for training, for staff development, all of those things. Do you see a model where you could actually take parts of those services and sell them profitably to your neighbours?
Yes, I think a LATCO is scalable. Again, I think it's the whole will of people to sit down and talk that through. But no, it's absolutely scalable.
And you don't have to just do the whole waste contract, do you? I mean, one of the things I'm school governor. One of the things that we do in our school is that because we've got some very key strengths in certain areas and no money, our teaching staff, in particular our senior leadership team, will go out and sell their services to other schools in the area to fix certain problems. That's a model that you could presumably adopt.
It is, and I think that the shared service model is sort of well trodden in terms of local authorities. You see that, but again, I think that's also is cyclical.
Yeah,
I think it's been very much not. I hate the phrase on trend, but that's been a well trodden path. Will that be the same in 10, 15 years' time? I don't know. And I think naturally it delivers when it's delivered well, like everything. When everything's done well, it delivers. And I think that's also some of the challenge that people see with things like garden waste or any sort of commercial service. They see a financial opportunity. They see them and they think, oh, that looks good. We can make some money out of that. But doing it well is bloody hard work, whether it's a commercial garden waste service, whether it's commercial waste collections. I mean, I think there's massive naivety sometimes, whether it's a private waste collector, regional waste collector, whether it's a national like Veolia or Biffa, it's bloody hard work. And they put a lot of time and effort into doing that. You can't just, as an authority, rock up and go, yeah, we'll offer a commercial waste collection.
No, and one of the things that frustrates me particularly around garden waste, but also around commercial waste, the driver for, say, a subscription garden waste service, the obvious thing is we can get a couple of million quid of revenue.
Yeah.
And that's a no-brainer. So politically, loads of effort is shoved into, let's get this done really quickly. We'll get the revenue in soon. But as you say, those interim solutions are then there 5 years later, and we've still got 3 or 4 officers manually. One authority I was speaking to fairly recently, they still manually enter every single subscription that comes through their website. They then have to manually transcribe it into the operational system because nobody's actually thought we could make this better, continuous improvement. And, once we've got the cash rolling through the door for the initial hit, the politicians have lost interest. The funding's gone. Nobody actually then says, why don't we spend a bit of money on a bit of technology and actually make all this work really seamlessly? And then perhaps we can scale it from garden waste to being, paid for bulky waste collections or whatever. We do lots of individual point solutions to get us over the line and then lose interest. Mm-hmm. We're not building a...
Yeah, totally. I wouldn't disagree with that. And it is not just about, signing up once a year and therefore collecting the bins or emptying the bins. You need to maintain that contact. You need to give people the reason. the obvious reason is, deliver a high level of service.
Yes.
In the main, we don't deliver it 100% of the time. Nobody ever does. There are certain areas where your challenges and will fall over. But you've got to keep in contact with, people, because there will be, and your customer, it is a customer that the council have. So they need to maintain that desire and need for that person to resubscribe the following year. Price is not always, I think, as sensitive as people make it out to be.
No,
yes, people aren't going to pay £250 a year for a garden waste service. But when you look at costs on a lot of authorities, and you equate it to, do you want to be queuing up into the tip to take up 2 or 3 bags? People haven't got the time to do that. Do you then want to be hoovering out your car afterwards? Do you live in an area where you then got to pre-book your tip visit? Are you going to be no? So the £35, the £55, whatever it is they charge, is phenomenally good value when you think, if you rang a taxi company and you asked for a taxi 26 times a week to take you somewhere, you would not get a taxi 26 times for what most authorities charge for their garden waste service.
But I don't think that's very well communicated to residents how much the actual cost is.
No,
and I think if people actually did know what the actual cost was, then maybe they would be less inclined to contaminate or do miss bins, or because I'm sure that there's no resident that will sit there going, I want to waste the council's money. Surely.
I disagree. I don't think people give a toss about saving the council money. They don't see it as theirs.
But they shouldn't see it as surely
the problem I think people see with council tax is the local authorities send it out and they collect it on behalf of the county and the police and the fire brigade. And yet the largest proportion of all your council tax goes to everybody else than actually the people who collect it. So the amount you'll see on social media with, the council are rubbish. I'm paying all this X £100 a year, and what do I get for it? And when you challenge sometimes on social media groups and you say, have you actually read the detail? Or your district council's amount hasn't gone up this year. It's your county council, it's the fire brigade, it's the police that have gone up. They don't understand even what you're saying because they haven't read the letter. People do not understand the process. They're not
interested. And the idea that they can save the council something, they don't see it as their money. They've paid it now, and it's the council that are just frittering it all away.
I can't believe that anyone would actually not necessarily save the council money, but not waste it. Surely, my brain tells me if I can make any small difference, then maybe, just maybe, over the next few years, the council tax won't have to go up so much, because if every single person in my council stopped putting nappies in the recycling bin, maybe there wouldn't be a need for that. And actually then they can invest the money in fixing those potholes, which Karen on Facebook messages about every day, or does other things and makes other investments. Surely most people would think like that, no?
I'd love to live in your world.
It's a really special world, Tim. It's a really lovely place to be.
And I think there's elements of that comes back to the whole communication piece. So your county council may do a great job in communicating what they're doing on pothole repairs, but if you do not engage with the channels that they're communicating that through, you tend not to see it. And if they do spend an awful lot of time and effort, let alone cost, what's the percentage of that return on effort? Because not everybody will be on Facebook. Not every, you'll get something through the letterbox probably once a year, and they'll tell you how wonderful everything's being done. But out of that percentage that land through the letterbox once a year, so probably quite a small percentage of people that will read it, let alone retain it. But if you don't do it, then people also moan.
Yes.
Yeah. You're never going to please everyone, are you?
But, come back to the age-old adage of, in the same way that we spend a lot of effort and time going to do miscollections and all the various bits that go wrong in the service and how you're going to communicate that, the most simplistic thing is if you don't miss them in the first place. So deal with the root cause of the problem. If potholes are being repaired, people wouldn't complain and be on social media. But there seems to be a lack of clarity of why things do not occur. So why aren't potholes being mended?
I think a little bit of education and
we've spoken too much about potholes.
We said the word pothole too much.
We have, yeah.
Say it one more time.
What You talk to many, and you experience many different authorities. What are the trends and common themes that you guys see from meeting to meeting and experiences?
It's moving towards communication rather than operations management. I think that's something that people are vaguely aware that they're going to have to start doing. So seeing a lot more interest in, as we talked about, integrating with the website, whether that's through a proprietary portal or through the council's web forms or whatever. But I think there's a growing gap between, waste is a utility. And if you look at, even the most boring thing in the world, my electricity bill, I get a little octopus on my app that dances around and I can spin the wheel to win my electricity bill back for the month. I've never won it. I probably never will. But it's gamified. And it's the dullest thing in the world. I turn the lights and the lights come on. It's electricity. If I order something from Amazon, I get a message to say thank you for your order. It's on its way. Fred's picked it. It's in the van. The van's called George. I get this all the time. In waste, we just do the job and then wait and see if someone complains. If they complain, then we start defending ourselves. Very, very passive. And I think that has to change. So that I think is the trend towards actually saying, this is the service you're getting. We've just delivered your bin. We've just emptied your bin. We just didn't empty your bin because it wasn't out. And actually pushing that message of not just waiting for the complaint, but actually pushing that you're in charge of this service and you know what's happening. I wouldn't dream of challenging Amazon about whether they actually do their own parcel or not, because I know I'd be wrong every time. And they know it. They're absolutely nailed on.
I think there's a balance. There's a balance somewhere in the middle, because there's the majority of things like waste collections occur. Residents get it. They'll put it out at the right place. They put it out at the right time. Do people want to have an email or a message to say when they're doing it right? And they've never had a missed collection in 2.5 years, 20 years, whatever. Don't communicate with them. Where there's been a service error, AI works in a way that says, actually, there's been a bit of an issue here. We will tell somebody when we've done something for a period. Yeah. So I think it's that sophistication, but I think it is also still those layers. I think there is a need for something arriving through the letterbox for some. There's a need for. So again, is that a development of how people want to engage, which we see all the time. You log onto a website. Do you want to be communicated by email or SMS text? Reality, do people pay much attention to that? Do they just go default? No. Spam everyone's getting more aware of and nervous of.
Louise, my view is that we councils constantly underestimate the appetite for electronic comms. We get this all the time. Oh, we've got quite an elderly population. They don't like the internet.
Yeah.
Every single stat that we look at, whether it's on Google Analytics or whether we look at the sales that come through garden waste portals, councils drastically underestimate the appetite for online services.
I think it's dated because of COVID. So all of that age, and I do believe that pre-COVID there probably was an age demographic issue with regards to scanning QR codes. That's the thing I have most to do with regards to technology, and I'm promoting actively to put a QR code on the garden waste permit so that people can have constant communication. Oh no, they won't use it because they're of a particular age demographic. Well, no, I don't think actually the facts are there anymore, because you look at everything, age demographic wise. People are using QR codes and they are scanning it. And I've only got a very small window of data at the moment because we only started it really this year for a lot of councils, but they're getting really high scan rates. So then therefore, surely then the data must be out of date.
And who's got the most time on their hands to engage with the waste service? It's retired people. They're invested in their property. They care about the planet and their grandchildren and all the rest of it, and they've got the time to do it. So actually, I see, and actually the other point you made about nobody's paying 250 quid for a garden waste service. You'd be amazed how many people are.
We had one the other day that had bought
on Christmas Day. They're buying the garden bins on Christmas Day.
Yeah,
and we've got authorities that are selling 5-6 garden waste bins at 50 quid a year.
I get that for multiple bins.
Yeah.
So
actually, I think there's a natural tendency in councils to try and price the service as low as they can. They're almost embarrassed. Oh, we're selling garden waste now. If you're given a free garden waste service now and you go to the resident and say, it's going to be 35 quid next year, you might as well say it's going to be 65 quid next year. You're going to get exactly the same amount of ire and angst on Facebook for 3 months. You might as well get 65
They're going to be annoyed
quid.
anyway, year one.
Yeah. Agreed.
And go in strong year one, because otherwise it's even worse year two. I remember there was a council 7 years ago and they did that, and then they put it up by £1. Oh, that was absolute outroar.
But I think
terrible.
it is how it is how you communicate, how you engage, and then also the renewals. So if your subscription service is 55 quid or whatever it is, and you're going to do it online, that's great. That's quite efficient. If somebody then can't engage online, so they register a form and then somebody rings them back, take this scenario to its, probably roll this one out, but so somebody will ring them back. The first probably thing they get is they don't trust the call coming in, so they think they're being scammed.
Yeah.
So you have to ring back 2 or 3 times. You then have to go through a situation, scenario. You've got to have then the right technology to take the payment over the phone, blah, blah, blah. That process could take anything from half an hour to 45 minutes, depending on the age profile, the capability, and then how many times, they don't pick up. So when you then equate that to officer time, to say I'm charging £55 a year or £75 a year, of which you've just now spent £25 of that £75 to recover, to get that money in, you're not making the money.
No.
So you've got a commercial operation would relatively factor that in.
Yeah.
And I do get, authorities have, there are obligations on them to be all inclusive and to be an all encompassing service, and an authority is trying to deliver everything it can to all people. But I think there's a position of conflict there in terms of delivering a commercial service that you cannot satisfy 100% of people all of the time.
Yeah.
Morrison's will not satisfy 100% of people all the time. You have consumer choice. If it's a non-statutory service, then you've got to turn around and say, it has to be on a commercial basis. Yes, if people can't engage online, give them an alternative. I think that is absolutely fair and reasonable. It's probably more reasonable than an online shopping service would do.
Yeah.
So, but you give them an alternative, but you don't give them an alternative to the alternative, because
which some do,
2% or 1.5% of people can't deal with, and then you don't give an alternative to the alternative to the alternative.
Oh yeah,
you have to at some point turn around and you have to manage that situation.
Yeah, I've seen authorities spend tens of thousands of pounds on putting in systems to handle payments at kiosks. And you think, why?
And the numbers are still quite small.
Well, if 200 people sign up at a kiosk at 50 quid, do the maths. It's not worth spending thousands of pounds on a system to
And
power
if they
that.
really want a garden waste bin, they normally would just get someone else to do it for them if they can't do it.
Well, I was in America last, as I said. So last week when I was in America, I had a discussion with a waste manager from Florida, and of course their vehicles are the side arm grabbers, so they just have the driver. There's no crew at the back or any of that sort of stuff. And I said, I was talking about assisted collections. And it was just this blank look. What do you mean assisted collections? Well, that's where we go into the garden or the yard, and we get the bin for them because they're disabled or handicapped in the American phrase. And he had no idea what I was talking about.
So what would they do?
If the bin's out, they'll pick it up. If it's not out, you don't get the service.
Yeah.
And it's, so you've got to get your neighbour to do it, or a member of the family to do it, or somebody to do it. But the waste collector's not doing it because he's driving a truck and there's no loaders to go and get it. So it's a very different scenario. We don't have that level of service.
It's assisted collections are a challenge, and been very challenging in the last couple of years. I mean, we are seeing literally 5 a week additional requests for assisted collections.
Wow. Okay.
Which is a high percentage, I think. What the reasoning before that, I mean, anybody looking in would go, well, there's quite a health socio-economic situation there in itself that is driving. But what is driving that demand? Is that demand being driven by the fact is that have we delivered an unreliable service? Therefore, people feel to overcome that service, they'll put themselves down as an assisted collection.
Yeah.
Are there genuine health issues and health reasons? But that growth also is not then connected, or the volume, or even if it's a high volume or a low volume, there is a cost associated with that assisted collection. Now, arguably, some will say, well, that's not a concern for the authority because they're duty bound to offer that service and provide that service. Great, understand that. But again, it's got to be controlled and managed. It can't be uncontrolled. Just everybody.
Surely it would have specifications that you would have to meet in order to get an assisted collection.
It's incredibly difficult, assisted collections, because yes, you can go online, and I've seen a spectrum of this. One authority I know, if you sign up and request an assisted collection, you get it. Because when we looked at the process was, I need an assisted collection. Oh, why do you need an assisted collection? You can't actually ask them any questions. You can't ask them about their medical history. You can't ask them about their leg, or you can't ask them any of those.
So
things.
Technically, in theory, anyone could ask for it, and you could have the whole round as assisted collections.
I've also seen stats where people fill in the form and say, do you have any conditions? And they click no, and then they say submit. Sorry, you can't have assisted collection. And 30 seconds later, the same IP address submits a form with some different answers, and you get this assisted collection. So actually, you've got this whole charade of pretending to validate an assisted collection. You simply can't.
Yeah.
So the decision taken was, we might as well just give them to them, because we're going to give them anyway. We'll just take out all the office time to get to that foregone conclusion. But the costs of assisted collection are huge. So you look at the time. You say it's an extra 30 seconds to collect each bin. You're getting 5 a week. So you've just added 2.5 minutes work every week to your collections. But that's 2.5 minutes of 2 guys stood at the back of the truck, a guy driving the truck doing 5 miles to the gallon and burning diesel. Yeah. It runs to a lot of money.
What's the percentage then of assisted collections?
Well, I did some maths on this a while ago, and in our, I think I took about 80 of our contracts, and it varied from 1.something% to over 11%.
Wow.
And actually, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of pounds to deliver at that end.
Yeah.
It's a huge cost.
That'd be really interesting to do sort of case study or fact sheet on that.
Well, if you click the link below, you can access my article that I wrote on this a little while ago.
Oh.
So we just had the announcement that we're going to have they call it a cap. It's actually a floor. You got to at least 2 weekly collections of residual waste. So 3 weekly is not an option. How do you feel about that?
Disappointed. It's probably the diplomatic answer. I think a number of people are probably frustrated at potentially that, because the opportunity, as we've said, for a number of the conversations and themes today, the pressures that are being applied on budgets and savings. And if you are promoting additional recycling schemes, you end up with your residual bin. So if you've taken out food, you're taking out garden, you're taking out, in the future, plastic film, you've taken out, what have we said, food, all the other paper, card, cans, plastics, and whatever. You get to a point of saying what ultimately is left. Now, yes, people will come back and say, I'm not going to recycle garden, I'm not going to subscribe or whatever. But the reality is the schemes are there. So what ultimately is left? And I think the authorities that have gone with the 3 weekly collection are delivering step change in their recycling performance.
They are, yeah.
So there is evidence there to say it generates. There's another sort of link back into the theme we've said around communication. You can ask people to do stuff. Yes, you want to get people to engage, but there is also the flip side of that, whereas you do have to sort of steer and direct. And if you're directing people to say, okay, well, we're only going to collect your bin 3 weekly, that will drive behaviours. That will drive people to engage directly or indirectly. You're always going to get people that will push back. I mean, look at the reactions we had when people went fortnightly. Oh, there'll be rats running around, there'll be flies everywhere and whatever. Now, if you went into a lot of areas and said, I'm going to take away your fortnightly waste collection, go back to weekly, people turn us and say, why? I don't want to do it. Or when we convert it to wheel bins, I want to take away your wheel bin and put you back on sacks. There'll be riots on streets. People, but sometimes people don't know what they don't know. So that's where policymakers is so key, that you have to steer, because they are the specialists. They know what will work, and it's proven what will work.
The biggest disappointment for me was when that announcement was made, and we had politicians saying, well, we don't want these smelly bins, and they shouldn't be smelly. It's only going to be smelly if you're putting the wrong stuff in it, because everything that would be left to go in the grey bin will be dry and inert. So there is no reason why it can't be 3 or 4 weekly. And the other thing that just hasn't been presented, everybody said, well, 3 weekly, that'd be terrible. It will save the council a fortune. It takes a huge cost out of the collection to only go every 3 weeks rather than every 2.
And I think the residency, and that's what they want to see, isn't it? If they are being okay with having a 3 weekly, I'm okay with it because I know more of the other side. I know what percentage of food waste is in that bin. So therefore, if that's weekly, then my bin's going to be empty, relatively empty.
I think the key message is that. Sorry, Tim. It's not to save a fortune. It's to use that existing budget to deliver the additional services that are now needed, be it those authorities who are not delivering weekly food, the cost of this plastic film collection. So it's not a question of saving budget. It's using that money more smarter to deliver more for the same amount. And it's the key message.
And it seems strange that when so many councils are quite rightly flagging up that the money under single recycling is not adequate, there was actually a great opportunity for the government to say, we'll go 3 weekly then, and you can save a bit of money and use that to fund the gap and diffuse that argument.
Yes.
But actually they haven't done that.
Is that because it's a popularity thing, because they don't want to...
Somebody who reads the Daily Mail might be outraged that they're going to get 3 weekly collections, not 2 weekly.
But I don't think that message will change politically. I don't. Yeah, it's just a PR spin scenario of the time. Yeah. And nobody, as you say, nobody wants to end up on the front page of the Daily Mail. I mean, look at all the things we went through with wheel bins and chips in bins. Oh Lord, it was.
What else would they write about?
I was on the front page of the Daily Telegraph for chips in bins back in 2011.
I need to see this.
They didn't put, not my face.
Oh, right, okay. Boring.
But you see it in reported terminology.
Yes.
It's not waste or refuse collection. Waste and refuse is not, or recycling is not referred to as a commodity. It's everything, whatever scheme, any paper or the press will always refer to everything going to landfill or whatever. In it, and they talk, and you made reference earlier to the YouTube clip of waste collections in the 70s. The media themselves are equally stuck in 1975. They do not understand what realistically goes on.
And one of the things that came up in the last podcast with Neil was he noticed, and he's right, that whenever there's a positive story in the press about the council, it's a picture of a teacher. If ever there's a negative story in the press about the council, it's a binman. That's the picture.
It is. I've noticed it ever since he said that. I really have noticed the images. I mean, not obviously always that, but it's always, they are very specific set of images, aren't they? To ignite.
If you look at Birmingham is in section 114, and your service is going to have to be cut. It's a picture of a binman. It's just every negative story has got a binman on it.
It is, because it's the one service that everybody resonates with, because it impacts on every resident and every household, every flat across the district, or authority. So it is the most widely used service.
Yeah, and they do seem to be the voiceless ones that are quite easy to kick out at. So I think we're just about out of time, but I'd like to thank you very much, David, for your insights and your frank opinions. It's been great talking to you, as always.
It has.
It's been fun. Thank you very much indeed. I think the key thing is, whatever we've talked about, is I think we come back to one thing, is there isn't a silver bullet on any of the things that we're talking about.
No, and in 2 years' time, we'll come back. We'll still be talking about the same things that are still going to be changing.
Which is why this podcast is going to be so beautiful, because it'll just keep going round in a circle.
Yeah. We might get better at it though, with a bit of luck.
No.
Do you think in gosh, we're talking about a YouTube clip in 1970. So let's fast forward 50 years. So whatever that takes us to. And so in 2070, will somebody looking back and going, it's hilarious. I've just found this podcast online and they're talking about the same issues that still haven't been resolved 70 years later. Quite possibly.
Yeah, I think
possibly.
So.
I mean, my kids think it's both hilarious and cringeworthy that I'm doing a podcast. That's already. So in 50 years' time, God knows.
I think it's cringy that we're doing a podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose the only saving grace is we won't be here in 70 years' time to know.
Absolutely not. But we've got our comment. We have our little place in history. Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you, as always, Louise.
Thank you. So we were much better today, weren't we?
We'll see you in the edit, won't we? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.